So a lot has been made about the pardoning of Joe Arpaio. From the left, you keep hearing the argument that this is going to be the end of democracy because President Trump, who can do no right on the eyes of the left, there's nothing that he can do that will somehow quiet their comments of negativity and destructiveness to President Trump's presidency. And the pardoning of Joe Arpaio is no exception. Their strategy is to take this and call it the end of democracy, call it some sort of favoritism that's being undertaken by President Trump to favor his rich friends, which, of course, Joe Arpaio, as far as I know, is not one of Trump's rich friends, but he's a friend indeed and a valuable ally to him in his campaign and in his agenda. So they're going to turn this into this incredible, monumental breach of the trust that the President of the United States is supposed to have with the American people. Look, it's a lie. They're again, just like with Hurricane Harvey, just with practically everything else that the left is trying to do right now, instead of engaging in positive, constructive conversations, they're going for the lie. This is not going to end democracy as we speak. This is not going to cause any major disruption, injustice throughout the country. What this is the latest salvo of President Trump's battle with, number one, the globalist non-borders crowd that doesn't want any restrictions on immigration. Yes, you heard me correctly, any restrictions. It's not just about the wall for these globalists. They believe in free borders. They believe in the free movement of people from one country to another. That cannot exist. That cannot exist. Even if we achieve that moment of nirvana where the whole world is at peace, kumbaya, and we're all just one big mass with nothing to live or die for, and no religion too, and no possessions, even if we reach that leftist nirvana, and yes, I'm quoting John Lennon's he calls Imagine, I call it Nightmare. Anyway, if you reach that John Lennon state of affairs, you still can't have an unfettered flow of human beings between borders. Why not? Well, because you have to keep track of who's where. You have to know who's where if you're going to provide services so that they don't have to, so they can continue in their drug-laden fantasy and state of bliss. You have to know how you're going to be able to support them. And if you need to know how you're going to be able to support them, you need to know where they are. So, even if we went to that level, you have to know who's crossing the border from Mexico to the United States, from the United States to Mexico, and the same thing with Canada, and the same thing all over Europe. So President Trump correctly ascertains that we have a vested interest in controlling our borders and the crossing, particularly from the south into the north, but there have been also problems in Canada, but particularly from the south to the north, there has been just an undocumented amount of movement across the border. It needs to be controlled. Why? Well, because even if we reach the nirvana state of John Lennon, we still have to know who's here and who's not, number two. And number one, we don't live in John Lennon's nirvana. There are people here who are trying to do evil. And by the way, there are people here who are trying to gain employment, and unfettered traffic of human beings with limited opportunities for employment equals pain and suffering for those who are here legally. So this is the war that President Trump finds himself in, and Sheriff Joe Arpaio was a strong ally. The problem with Sheriff Arpaio, at least in the eyes of the law, was that apparently, according to the prosecution, Joe Arpaio was engaged in selected arrests and selected stoppings of individuals based on what he thought would be their immigration status, and what he thought would be in their immigration status in the eyes of the judge was their appearance as it relates to whether they looked Hispanic or not. That's what this is all about. Now, Arpaio was ordered not to do it. He was ordered to stop by the court, but he continued. So what ended up happening was a contempt of court charge that was conviction that was successfully prosecuted. So Sheriff Arpaio is subject to punishment for this violation of a court's order. So let's look at this. What does that mean? This is a man following the president's agenda against those who don't want to control the flow of immigration, which is a big deal for President Trump. And number two, it is the court interceding in a manner that can be perceived as being agenda-driven, i.e., the court is in favor of continuing the immigration battle. And by the way, immigration status quo. And by the way, whether this particular judge in Arizona was involved in that or not, we know that the Ninth Circuit absolutely, and most of the appellate courts that we're seeing throughout the country absolutely are in on some anti-Trump policy agenda, because they are purposefully interpreting their rulings, they're purposely interpreting the law to Trump. And so the president is involved in a war. Make no mistake, this is a war. There's many fronts to the war. This just happens to be one or two of them, depending on how you want to count them. So we have a situation where Joe Arpaio is one of his lieutenants involved in this battle against the judiciary and against the immigration crowd, pro-immigration crowd, pro-illegal immigration crowd, and he gets convicted for contempt of court. He hadn't been convicted for any of the things that he had been accused of being done. No, it was the contempt of court that he was convicted for. And the president decides to pardon him. Okay, look, it's the president's call. It's the president's call. The president can do it for any reason he wants. Article 2, Section 2 of the Constitution specifically says, and he shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment. The only exception is in the case of impeachment. And by the way, he can't do it unless the crime has already been committed. So you can't do it until there's been a crime committed. So ostensibly here, a crime has been committed. Why? Because the judge says so. The crime is what? Well, not really immigration violation policy, although the whole confrontation stems from it. The crime is contempt of court. Sheriff Joe is disobeying the court. The court decides to take it to convict him and punish him. President Trump believes, look, the courts right now are battling me and battling my lieutenants and interfering with my agenda of the future of the United States of America, a future that, by the way, has been stamped by approval by the majority of the Electoral College. I got elected president, and you guys are standing in the way. I'm going to pardon this guy. It's my call. I feel like doing it. I will do it. Now, one of the things that you could look at is you could look at what the purpose was of for including the pardon. And honestly, the pardon looks like it was included only because there were times when the founding fathers or the framers recognized that there could be a situation where the law would be too harsh, and there was room for clemency and there was room for mercy. And as a matter of fact, in the Federalist Papers, number 74, not the Federalist Pages, that lowly piece of literature written by me, but the Federalist Papers, that incredibly iconic collection of historical writings by Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay that explains our Constitution. In that collection, specifically in number 74, Alexander Hamilton speaks of the pardoning clause for the President of the United States. And he says the following: humanity and good policy conspire to dictate that the benign prerogative of pardoning should be as little as possible fettered or embarrassed. What does that mean in 21st century speak? We should interfere with it as little as possible. Let the president do whatever he wants to do. He continues, the criminal code of every country partakes so much of necessary severity that without an easy access to exceptions in favor for unfortunate guilt, justice would wear a countenance too sanguinary and cruel. Well, in the eyes of President Trump and in the eyes of many Americans who feel that Joe Arpaio was engaged in a noble war against the judiciary and trying to forward a political cause, the criminal code of our country partook of such necessary severity that without an easy access to exceptions in favor of unfortunate guilt, justice would wear a countenance too sanguine and cruel for Joe Arpaio. And specifically, the key words here are unfortunate guilt. These people believe that Joe Arpaio was the victim of an unfortunate guilt. So did President Trump. So he pardoned him. That's it. It's as simple as that. Now, look, lest we forget that so many other presidents have observed the pardon. And one of the greatest, most heralded pardons is that by George Washington, who pardoned John Mitchell and Philip Vigil. And who were they? Well, they were rebels in the Whiskey Rebellion, and he pardoned them. Franklin Delano Roosevelt has 2,819 pardons. Harry Truman, 1,913. Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1,110 pardons. Woodrow Wilson, 1,087 pardons. List goes on and on. Amongst the least, actually, is President Barack Obama, 212 pardons. And George W. Bush with 189 and George H.W. Bush with 74. President Trump, one. One. That's it. Just one. So before everybody goes on freaking out and before you hear all the left's indignation, just take a pause and remember what this battle is about and just realize that this is what it was going to look like if we really got a president that was really going to engage in an Herculean battle to salvage the future of this country. It was going to be sloppy. It was going to be nasty. It was going to be ugly. And that's the way it is today. My name is Dr. Julio Gonzalez, and you're listening to the Federalist Pages.